thought it was time for some purely Riley content instead of messing around with old Land Rovers. This is the model I was making. It's coming along quite nicely. ABS is a much nicer plastic to model with than PLA. With the PLA I found it was really difficult to glue. That's this white one. Difficult to glue, difficult to sand. Just not quite as strong, I think. Whereas the ABS seems to be a lot nicer. It's much nicer to sand, and it takes super glue really well. When I worked at Weta, the props guys were always making props from 3D printed parts printed in ABS. They were forever super gluing things together and sanding them back, so I know it works. Still need to glue on the last bits, but I want to print a few more pieces first. That's not really what I wanted to talk about. I've started making the rear shock absorber mounts. This is one of them there, and it's a bit hard to see. If we look from the top, you can see that they're angled to match the angle of the chassis. So I already know that that's 8 degrees, so I've modeled it like that. And what I'm actually going to do is make this in 2 pieces. This will be a disc of steel, and I'm machining the pins separately. What I'm going to do is on the mill I'll drill this hole through the middle at the correct angle, and I've made this so hopefully it's a nice tight fit in there. And then if I could, oops, it's a bit difficult for me to make this rotate because I need to hold down the shift key, but let's see. Oops, should be able to do it. There we go, we can orbit round. That'll push through, and I'll be able to weld that from the inside so that that won't go anywhere. If I do it like this, I can get a really nice solid weld in there. I'll probably bevel this edge as well so that I get a nice solid weld there, and hopefully that should be nice and strong. The reason we can rotate this around, the reason I wanted to do it in 2 parts is because I'm not sure exactly what length this needs to be at the moment. I need to play with that, and I'll show you on the car why that comes into effect. But this one should be close enough, and that's what I am 3D printing at the moment, is just a rough version of that. So that'll take another few hours to print. I'm printing it at 0.3mm resolution. It doesn't need to be hugely fine or accurate, so that speeds up the printing time quite a lot. The other thing to note on this piece is this angle. Let's change this back to pan. This angle on here matches the taper on the inside of the bushes on the shock absorber mounts, so that when the nut is done up tightly, it's clamping the inner metal part of the mount on the shock. And we can have a look at that out in the garage as well. This is the first pin I'm machining up on the lathe. I've carefully measured everything up. So to build the model, I measured up one of the existing pins, and I'm basically just copying that. And this pin will fit through. This is the shock absorber, and you can probably just about see on there, there's a taper, which matches the taper on the pin. And if you look at the nuts, they've also got that matching taper. It was a little bit fiddly measuring that. It took a little bit of trial and error, but the number I came up with was 50 degrees. It's not quite 45, and it's not quite the 55 that, say, a fishtail gauge for a Whitworth thread is. So I sort of carefully measured it and drew some things up and eventually ended up with 50 degrees, which seems to match pretty well. And I've tested it on the actual fit of the pin. And what I ended up doing, I didn't really need to measure it at all, was making up a little angle sort of form tool thing. And I made sure that this matched the angle on the existing pins, and then I was just able to use that to form that angle on there. This is the first time I've actually used my new quick change post on this lathe, and it's really good. It works really well. It's very, very rigid as well, which helps on a little lathe like this. So I could go ahead now and cut the thread on here, apart from one small thing I didn't quite think about, which was my length of high tensile steel bar here is going all the way through, and I would need to get to the change gears, which is a little bit tricky when you've got that in the way. But that's okay. I can take that out now, and I'll be able to rechuck that up in the lathe and machine the thread on here, because it doesn't need to be hugely concentric or anything. It just needs to be good enough for the nut to come down and clamp that bush on this section. The reason for the angle, I think I've got one set up here. So I'm still missing the 1/2-inch bolts that hold this plate on. So I've just got, it's just sitting on a smaller bolt for now and clamped on the other side. This is another one of these details where it's really, really hard to see exactly how this goes. So I have to thank my friend John overseas, who sent me the pictures of his mounting, and that's how I knew what I had to make. He's building a very, very accurate Brooklands replica. So if that's a detail that's on his car, if I copy that, I know it's going to be correct. Looking at pictures of other cars, originals and replicas, when this is all set up properly, the nut here is about level with the top of the spring, maybe just a little bit above. And you can see you can actually move this around. So, you know, there's no reason you couldn't mount those up like that. But as you vary the height of this shock, the gap between the mount and the chassis rail, which you can see is on an angle, actually it's a bit hard to see, but you can see that the chassis rail isn't straight like this, it's on an angle like that. So as you change the position of this, the distance between the bush and the chassis rail changes, which means the length of that pin will change. So the only detail I'm not really certain about is exactly where that pin needs to go along the chassis. And I don't think it really matters, but I suspect the way I need it is effectively vertically in line with this one. That's probably what I'm going to do. Going by the measurements on John's one, that looks like more or less where his is as well. I have seen pictures of supposedly original ones where one of them's mounted way up like this. That doesn't look right. And I've also seen them where instead of a pin on a big flat base that's bolted to the chassis rail, there's actually a plate, a bit similar to how the front axle is done. So there's a plate that comes down with the pin down here, and it bolts onto that. But my thinking is it should probably be vertical, and it looks best when it's vertical, and that gives me about the sort of spacing that I've seen in here between the plate and the pin. But because I'm making mine in two pieces like that, I can adjust that a bit, of course. I can slide the pin in and out and then chop it to length and weld it. The 3D model will just help me check that I've got the angle correct before I go drilling any of the plates, and more or less the positioning as well. So hopefully I could get those done in the next few days. This is just showing how the rear shock mount on the front springs is done. And you can see in between the axle and the spring here, there's this plate. It's about 1/4 inch plate, and it's bent up on the end to take a pin that goes through for the bottom shock mount. So I have seen pictures of cars, like I say, originals and replicas, where they use a similar setup on the rear of the chassis. And that's one of the difficulties with these cars, is knowing what is correct, because no two seem to be the same, and the different details vary from car to car, even on ones that are supposedly very original. It's very hard to know when they're 90 years old, and you don't know if they've been rebuilt or modified over the years. I had to close my shed doors because the people next door are obviously having a New Year's Eve party, and they've got the music up quite loud, and I didn't want to get any sort of content hits on it. So hopefully you can't hear that in the background. But I've threaded the first of these pins, which has gone pretty well. So the little castle nut will go on the end, like that. And this is the first time I've been able to make use of the threading indicator I built, or modified rather, for this lathe. It didn't come with one, but I just bought a, I think it's 16 tooth, sort of generic mini lathe one off AliExpress, and modified that so that would fit on this lathe. And that works really well, works perfectly. It's a 16 tooth per inch lead screw, and I think it's a 16 tooth gear. So I believe that means I could engage this at definitely any of the full marks, possibly the halves as well. I'd have to go and look all of that up again, because it always gets a bit mysterious to me. But because this is the first time I've done it, I've just been waiting until it comes back round to 1 every time, and then I know for certain it's correct. And the other thing I got to use for the first time was the tailstock die holder. And I got this a while ago as well. And unfortunately I bought the wrong one. I got the wrong size taper on it. The taper was too big. And I ended up machining up my own taper for it, just from a piece of steel bar. And this is the first time I've ever actually used that as well. And that also worked really well. So I was able to cut the thread on the lathe, and I just ran the die over it just to make sure it was nice and clean. And as you can see, that actually works nicely. So I think what I need to do is put the shock on here just to make sure I've got the length correct. I'll machine off the end of this just to make sure it's at the right length, so not too much thread is sticking out. And I won't drill a cross hole for the sort of castle nut here until the whole thing's finished, because I like to be able to orient the holes so that the split pins are in a sensible place. So it kind of makes sense if they come through from the top. But I'm really pleased with how that worked. It's also the first time I've really done anything since I got the quick change, as I mentioned before, and that's working beautifully as well. So that's gone really well. I just have to do the second one now. That's both of the pins finished. One of them was the exact right length, where the end of the thread is just past the end of the nut, and the other one needed just a fraction machining off it to make it perfect. But those have come out really well. And I think I must have the taper right, because it does lock up on there quite nicely once you do up the nut. And that locks it in place. So all I really need now to finish this off is make the larger discs, but I think that's going to be a job for tomorrow. I'm also going to have to buy a suitable drill bit so I can drill the hole for these. I do have a 3/4 inch reamer, but I don't actually have a 3/4 drill bit. I didn't need one before because I was only drilling through the chassis rail, which was only 13 mil sorry, 3mm 1/8 thick steel. So I was able to drill a hole with a step drill and then carefully file it out and then use the reamer on that. But because these discs are going to be half an inch thick, I'm going to need a proper drill bit to actually be able to get through them. The other thing that's going to be interesting is just cutting off the blanks, because all I've really got to do that, unless I tried the bandsaw, but I think the best thing will be an angle grinder with a cutting disc, and I'll just do a couple of thin slices through here, and then I should be able to chuck these up in the lathe and face them off. And then it's a matter of figuring out how to mount them in the mill on a slight angle, but I'll probably do what I did before, which was effectively a couple of V-blocks either side of it, and you can mount them in the vise at the appropriate angle. I can't remember, I think I cut a little metal gauge, like a wedge, that's the right 8-degree sort of angle, and use that to sit everything flat on that to get the right angle. So hopefully I've still got that, I'm pretty sure I do. But as I say, that'll be a job for tomorrow, I think. And the last thing for today is my little mock-up finished printing. It's pretty rough. I didn't print it at very high resolution, and I forgot that I had it set to print solid, so that's solid plastic. I could have used infill to save a bit of time, but hopefully that'll be good enough just for me to put on the car and just get a visual check that I do have the angle correct. So it should be kind of like that, basically. And that should be that 8-degree angle. But you can see how I'm going to need to drill the hole through the plate at an angle, and I'll be able to weld that pin in place from the back through there. And that should be nice and strong, I think. I don't think that's going to go anywhere. The shock absorber arms are only made out of aluminium anyway, so I'm not sure exactly how much strength needs to be in this. That welded, that should all be fine. It's the next day now. It's actually New Year's Day, and I made up the pins yesterday, and today I'm making the bases for them. And I've already started on one. I basically cut a piece off the bar and faced either side in the lathe. I made this half an inch thick, and at the moment I'm going to drill the holes for the mounting bolts. So I've got this set up in the mill, and I just carefully marked out the 3 holes for the mounting. I'm not going to drill a hole for the middle yet, because that of course has to be done at an angle, and somewhere around here hopefully I still have my little angle plate that I used last time. I had to do an angle. If not, I'll have to make another one. But machining this up on the lathe is no problem. I ended up making it a little bit thicker. It's a bit hard from the photos to get the exact thickness. It doesn't really matter. I think it's probably 7/16 thick, and I made it ½ inch instead, just because it was easier to machine on the lathe and it kept the tool away from the chuck jaws. I was starting to get a little bit close, and I was just too lazy to shift this along. So I figure making it thicker doesn't matter, it makes it stronger. So as long as it fits on the car, which it should. Speaking of which, somewhere around here, every so often I have to stop and do a big cleanup of all my, here it is, bits and pieces, kind of a reset of the shed, just to get back to clean. But this is the 3D printed one, and I've kind of indexed it so there's one hole right at the top, but you can see how that on the chassis takes care of the angle, and this would actually mount, it's a bit hard with one hand, but it goes down under there. I'm pretty sure it needs to be vertically in line with this one. That seems to make the most sense. So, but given that that all looks like it's working quite nicely, like I say, I've started making the first one. I'm pretty sure I don't have the right size drill bit to drill that hole through the middle anyway. That's something I'm going to have to order, and that might take a week or so to arrive, given it's the holidays. Cutting this bar can be a little bit of a problem. It's 60mm diameter bar, and it's actually still quite warm. You can see I'm going through and cutting it. If I'd thought about this, I would have got them to cut slices for me on the bandsaw when I ordered it from the engineering place up the road. But I thought, well, I've got a 100mm grinder, 4-inch grinder. I should be able to go through 60mm steel, no problem. But of course, the problem is, even though it's a 100mm disc, you don't get 100mm depth of cut from it. So this one is slightly used now, and you can see I can only get about 20mm out of that. So effectively get about 1 inch of cutting depth, which means I can't go all the way through this. Even if I go all the way around, I have to do the last little bit by hand with a hacksaw. And of course the other problem is these thin cutting discs. They're really good, very nice and thin. You can do a lot with them, but of course effectively they're grinding discs, so as you use them they get smaller and smaller, which means when you want to cut out the middle of the bar, that's when you need the biggest diameter disc. So if you start with a big one and they're coming in from the outside, by the time you get down to the middle, this has got smaller, so of course it's not cutting anymore. So what I've been doing is using up my half-used ones and starting the cuts with those, and then switching to a new one just to get the middle section. And then, like I say, I'm having to then resort to finishing the rest with a hacksaw. I know for the guys in the US and in the UK, it's winter at the moment, so it's cold. I know Arco did some shots of the snow around his workshop and how deep all of that was, and the UK guys talking about the cold. We've got the opposite problem here, of course, because it's summer, so it's actually really hot. And being New Zealand, of course, it's not so much the heat that's the problem, it's the sunlight. You just get sunburnt. You know, it takes literally minutes to get burned. So I'm trying to minimize the amount of things I do outside, but hacksawing through the last half inch or so of the middle of this, it's actually quite hard work today. Thinking about it for a little while, I realized I don't need to drill any extra holes. I can just use the same little fixture and just set it up in the vise differently. I've got the little angle meter here, and it's easy enough to use that to set it up to the 8 degrees I need. And if you're wondering why they are handed like that, if you look at it, because there's 3 mounting holes, you've got that hole on the top. So if you imagine we're standing at the back of the car, the chassis rails taper inwards towards the back. So for that pin to be perpendicular to the direction of the car, with that hole at the top on this side of the car, it would be that way around. If you want that on the other side of the car, you'd have to flip it over. So it would be like that, which now means you've got 2 holes at the top to get it the same way. So they are definitely handed. And this is where having these little 3D printed models really helps, because it helps me visualize, because I can see exactly what's going on. I just find that helps me understand how things work and how they're going to look. I'm pretty good at picturing things in my head, but when you see it physically, it just takes away any doubt. So that was well worth actually printing up. I was just thinking, actually, if you did mount them, if you did drill them the same and mounted one with the holes 2 at the top, 1 at the bottom, and it's the opposite on the other side of the car, I'm betting nobody would ever notice.